It is the night of the 14th of May, 1741. The wind is screaming through the rigging at a pitch no man aboard has ever heard. They are 6,000 miles from England, and they do not know where they are. The ship is called HMS WAGER. She is a 28-gun store ship, formerly of the East India Company, now flying the colors of the Royal Navy. For 6 weeks she has been alone, separated from her squadron in the storms south of Cape Horn, driven east by a wind that will not stop. Her sails are in ribbons. Her hull works in the swell like a creature that has forgotten how to die. In his cabin, Captain David Cheap lies in his cot, immobile. 3 days ago, he fell down a hatchway in the dark and dislocated his shoulder. The ship's surgeon has reduced the joint and bound the arm tight against his ribs. He cannot walk the deck. He cannot stand a watch. He gives his orders through a midshipman who carries them up the ladder into the rain. On deck, the men can see nothing. The lookout in the foretop has not seen the horizon in 3 days. The water is black. The sky is black. The only light comes from the spray, which catches what little moon there is and throws it back as a kind of gray smoke. At 4:30 in the morning, something underneath the ship strikes against a rock. The hull splits. The sound is not a crack. It is closer to a gunshot, deep and final, and it travels the length of the ship and into every body aboard. A boy in the rigging starts to climb. He does not know what he is climbing toward. He only knows that the deck is no longer safe. His name is John Byron. He is 16 years old. He is the grandfather of a poet who has not been born yet. He is going to live. Most of the men around him will not. To understand how the WAGER came to be on a rock in the South Pacific, one has to go back almost 2 years to a war that began with an ear in a jar. In 1738, an English sea captain named Robert Jenkins appeared before the House of Commons holding a glass container. Inside it, preserved in spirits, was a piece of his own ear. He claimed a Spanish coast guard had cut it off 7 years earlier in the Caribbean after boarding his ship and accusing him of smuggling. He held the jar up, and members of Parliament leaned forward to see. Whether the ear was actually his, no one knows. What is known is that Britain was looking for a reason. Spanish control of the Pacific coast of the Americas had been absolute for 2 centuries, and English merchants wanted in. The ear was enough. The war was declared in October 1739. It would later be given the name the War of Jenkins' Ear, though most of the men who fought in it never heard the phrase. Within a few months, the Admiralty in London began planning a secret expedition. The idea was simple in language and almost impossible in practice. A squadron of British warships would sail from Portsmouth round the southern tip of South America and appear in the Pacific. Once there, they would attack Spanish shipping along the coast of Chile and Peru. The great prize was the Manila Galleon, the annual treasure ship that sailed from Acapulco to the Philippines and back, carrying silver from the mines of Potosi. To command this squadron, the Admiralty chose Commodore George Anson. Anson was 42 years old. He had served in the Navy since he was 15. He was patient, slow to anger, and methodical to the point of cruelty toward his own ambitions. The men who served under him would describe him later as someone who said almost nothing and missed almost nothing. His face in the portraits is closed. He was given 6 warships and a manpower problem. The Royal Navy in 1740 was at war on 3 fronts and could not find enough sailors to crew the ships it already had. To fill out Anson's squadron, the Admiralty pressed 500 soldiers and Marines, and then made up the remainder by emptying the wards of the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, a home for pensioned-off old soldiers. Of the men marched down to Portsmouth, many were over 60, some were over 70, some had to be carried aboard on stretchers. The fitter pensioners deserted on the road. The ones who actually reached the ships were the ones too sick to run. One of the ships chosen for Anson's squadron was HMS WAGER. She had not been built for war. She had been built as an East Indiaman, a trading ship designed to carry tea and cotton between London and Bombay. The Royal Navy had purchased her, cut gun ports into her sides, and added 28 cannon. She rolled badly under sail. Her timbers were soft pine in places where they should have been oak. She was, at best, a floating warehouse. The Admiralty assigned her the role of store ship and packed her hold to the deckhead with gunpowder, brandy, small arms, and the spare anchors and cordage for the rest of the squadron. In other words, she carried everything the expedition could not afford to lose. Her captain, when she sailed, was an officer named Dandy Kidd, who would die of fever in the South Atlantic. After him, the command passed to David Cheap. Cheap was 43. He was Scottish, the son of a country gentleman, and he had spent more than 20 years in the Navy without rising past lieutenant. The WAGER was his first command. He had been Anson's first lieutenant aboard the flagship Centurion, and he understood that this expedition was the only chance he was ever going to have. If he came back with the treasure, he would come back rich. If he came back without it, he would come back nothing. He was the kind of officer who did not bend because he could not afford to. Below him, in the chain of command of a Royal Navy ship, came the warrant officers, the master, the surgeon, the carpenter, the boatswain, and the gunner. The gunner of the WAGER was a man named John Bulkeley. Bulky is harder to draw than Cheap, because Bulky left a journal, and the man on the page is the man he wanted to be seen as. He was in his 40s. He was literate, which set him apart from most of the men aboard. He was a Methodist, which set him apart further. He read his Bible aloud in the evenings on the gun deck, and the men listened. He was competent at his job, and quietly certain that he was more capable than the men set over him. In a war, this is a useful sort of officer. In a shipwreck, it is a dangerous one. Among the midshipmen aboard the WAGER was a 16-year-old named John Byron. He was the second son of a baron. He had been at sea for 3 years. He was tall, dark-eyed, prone to seasickness, and writing letters home that his mother kept. He would later publish an account of what happened to him on this expedition, and his grandson, born 47 years after the wreck, would read it as a child and never quite recover from it. The grandson's name was George Gordon. The poems came later. There was also a midshipman called Henry Cozens. He was 23. Bulky would later describe him as a quarrelsome drunkard. Byron would describe him as a friend. Both descriptions are likely true. He had been in the Navy since he was a boy. He liked his drink. He spoke to officers in a way that he should not have. He was, in the spring of 40 UST, alive and on the muster roll. The squadron, 6 warships and 2 supply tenders, weighed anchor at Spithead on the 18th of September, 1740. The summer they had been waiting for, the summer they had needed in order to round Cape Horn at the right season, was gone. They were 9 months late. No one in command corrected the schedule. The orders were the orders. They sailed south. The squadron sailed in light winds for the first weeks, and the men were as well as men are at the start of any voyage. They drilled the great guns. They scrubbed the decks. The Chelsea pensioners sat in the waist where they had been told to sit and watched the working of a ship they would never be asked to work. By the time they crossed the equator, the pensioners were dying. The disease was called scurvy. The crews of the Royal Navy had known it for 200 years and did not yet know what caused it. They knew the signs. The gums turned spongy and bled. Old wounds, long healed, broke open again as if the body had forgotten how to be whole. The men's breath stank, their teeth fell out. They went weak, then weaker, and then they could not be roused. The ship's surgeon applied the usual remedies: vinegar, a tincture made from the bark of a Peruvian tree. None of it did anything. The pensioners died first because they had been the weakest to begin with. By the time the squadron reached Madeira, they were going over the side wrapped in their hammocks, 2 and 3 a day. The cannonballs used to weight the hammocks were running short. The squadron put in at the island of St. Catherine, off the coast of Brazil, for water and rest. 2 months in port did not stop the deaths. When they sailed again, in January of 1741, the men in the rigging were thinner than the men who had climbed up there in September. Then came the Horn. The Cape of Good Hope is famous, and the Strait of Magellan is famous. But the Horn is something else. It is a narrow funnel of water between the South American continent and the Antarctic ice, where the westerly winds of the southern hemisphere circle the planet without obstruction. There is nothing to slow them. There is nothing to break them. Sailors in 1741 spoke of the Horn the way infantry spoke of a fortress. Anson's squadron began the rounding in March. They should have begun it in November. They beat westward into the wind for 58 days. The waves were the height of the mainmasts. The ships went up the face of each one and came down the back as if dropped, and the timbers groaned in a way that suggested they were thinking about giving up. Sails blew out and were replaced and blew out again. Men were sent aloft to fight the canvas in the dark, and a number of them did not come down. They fell into the sea, and the sea took them, and the ship sailed on because the ship could not stop. Aboard the WAGER, the men slept in their clothes. The clothes had not been dry in weeks. The wool absorbed the spray and the rain and held it against the skin, and the skin in the cold began to come away from the bone. Frostbite took fingers. The cook could not light a fire. The men ate what could be eaten cold, which was salt pork that had gone slimy and biscuit that the weevils had been at for a year. The pensioners who were still alive were no longer alive after the first week of the Horn. On the 7th of April, the squadron, which had been in sight of itself for 7 months, began to come apart. The Pearl was the first to disappear, then the Severn. The ships had been driven south by a storm that lasted, by the surgeon's count, 18 days without break. When the sky finally cleared enough to take a reading, the captains discovered that they were further south than they had believed, and further east. They thought they had rounded the Horn. They had not. They were still in the Atlantic, and the wind was pushing them back the way they had come. Anson's flagship, Centurion, with the smaller ships Gloucester and Trial, fought westward and eventually broke through. They turned north and ran for the rendezvous point off the island of Juan Fernandez. The WAGER did not make it. She had become separated in the night, in conditions in which separation meant simply that the lookout could no longer see the stern lantern of the ship ahead. Captain Cheap, when he understood that he was alone, gave the order to continue north into the Pacific. He believed he had passed the Horn. He had not. His estimate of his longitude was, by hundreds of miles, wrong. The science of longitude in 1741 was a guess refined by a chronometer that had not yet been built. John Harrison's clock, which would finally solve the problem, was still in pieces in a workshop in London. Until it was finished, the navigator at sea estimated his east-west position by sailing for a number of hours at an estimated speed in an estimated direction and writing down what he hoped was true. The WAGER's master and her captain disagreed about where she was. The master, Thomas Clark, believed they were close to the coast. He recommended they head further out to sea before turning north. He said this several times in front of witnesses, and Captain Cheap refused him. Cheap had his orders. The rendezvous was Juan Fernandez. He had been told more than once by Anson himself that the success of the expedition depended on every ship that could possibly reach the rendezvous reaching it. He was carrying half the small arms and a quarter of the gunpowder of the entire squadron. He was already weeks late. He was a new captain on his first command, and his commodore, the man who had made him a captain, was waiting for him in the Pacific. He gave the order to hold the course. The Patagonian coast in 1741 was effectively unknown to European cartographers. The Spanish had been there, the Dutch had been there. No one had bothered to chart it accurately because there was nothing on it worth charting. The coast was rock and ice and rainforest. The mountains came down to the water without any beach in between. There were no harbors. There were no settlements. There was nothing on the maps except the words Tierra Inhospitalis, the land that hates you. The WAGER, with a captain in his cot and a master being overruled, ran north toward this coast at 6 knots, all sail set, in driving rain. It is the night of May the 13th, going on the 14th. The lookout in the foretop has not seen the horizon in 3 days. A little after 4 in the morning, the man at the masthead sees something to leeward. He cannot tell at first what it is. It is a darker shape against the dark of the sea, the way a tree at night is darker than the field behind it. He calls down to the deck. The lieutenant of the watch runs to the side and looks. It is land. The order goes out to bring the ship into the wind. The men move. They are not fast because they have not been fed properly in months, and they have not slept properly in weeks. The sails come up. The wheel is put over. The ship does not turn. The reason the ship does not turn is in dispute. Bulky would later write that the rudder fouled on something. Byron would write that the topsails carried away. The master would say only that the sea was running too high to come about. Whatever the reason, the WAGER, head on to a coast nobody had charted in a wind that gave her no margin, struck. The first impact lifts the bow. The men in the foretop are thrown into the rigging like shaken fruit. 2 of them die in the fall. The ship comes down again, broadside to the swell, and is taken up by the next wave and dropped again onto another rock, and this time something breaks. Water enters the hold. The men below in their hammocks wake to find themselves in 3 feet of sea. The cooper, in his storeroom, drowns trying to climb a ladder that has moved sideways in the dark. On deck, the discipline of the Royal Navy lasts for perhaps 4 minutes. By 5:15, men are at the spirit room with axes. They break in. They drink the brandy out of the casks while it pours onto the floor. Within 20 minutes, half of the crew is unable to stand. The boatswain, John King, who is in charge of the running gear and the discipline of the lower deck, is among the drunkest. He stands in the waist, swinging a cutlass at no one in particular, and shouting at the captain to come up and face him. Captain Cheap cannot come up. He is still in his cot. The arm that was reset 2 weeks ago has not healed. He is helped to a chair and then to the deck, and from the chair he tries to give orders to men who cannot hear them. The ship is breaking up underneath them. The mainmast goes by the board at 6:30, taking 3 men with it. The sea comes in through the side of the ship by then in long curved sheets, like a thing being poured. There are 2 small boats and a longboat aboard the WAGER. The carpenter, John Cummins, gets the longboat over the side without losing it. The 2 cutters follow. The boats are full of men in minutes. They row for the shore, which they can now see is a long beach of black rocks and pebble, perhaps half a mile away, with a steep wooded coast rising behind it. The dawn that day comes slowly. It is gray from the start and stays gray. The men who reach the beach are wet, drunk, exhausted, and beginning to feel the cold in a way they will not stop feeling for a year. They sit on the black stones and watch the ship. By the time the light is full, more than 30 of their shipmates are dead. Some have drowned in the wreck. Some have died of cold in the boats. Some, the worst of the drunk, are still aboard the WAGER, refusing to leave, drinking what is left in the casks. They will go down with her in the next high tide. 145 men reach the shore. They look up from the beach at the country that is going to keep them. It is rock and moss. It is rain. It is a forest of stunted trees, twisted by the wind, that begins at the edge of the beach and goes on, as far as anyone can see, in every direction. There is no smoke from any fire. There are no tracks of any animal larger than a bird. The wind off the water does not stop. Captain Cheap is carried up the beach in a chair by 4 men. He sits at the high water line in his sodden uniform, his arm bound, and looks at his command. The command consists of 145 wet men, 3 boats, a few casks of salvaged powder, and the back end of a broken ship grinding itself splinters on the rocks behind them. He gives an order. He says they will build a camp. No one says anything. The first week, they are still sailors. They build a row of huts above the beach out of canvas and broken spars. They organize a salvage operation, sending the longboat back and forth to what is left of the ship, pulling up barrels of flour, casks of brandy, sacks of dried peas, 2 sows, and the captain's silver tea service, which Cheap insists be brought ashore intact. The carpenter oversees the work. The captain, sitting in his chair on the beach, oversees the carpenter. The first man dies on land on the 3rd day. He is one of the Marines, and he has been sick since before the wreck. They bury him in the sand because the ground further inland is too wet to dig. The sand will not hold him long. The tide will find him. The island they have come ashore on, they discover, is not the mainland. It is an island of perhaps 15 miles across, hilly, soaked in peat, and almost without food. There are no deer. There are no useful birds. There are mussels at low tide, and a kind of celery growing in the boggy places, and seals occasionally on the rocks at the south end. The seals can be clubbed if a man is fast enough and quiet enough, which most of them are not. They name it WAGER Island because they have to call it something. By the end of the 3rd week, the rations are short. By the end of the 2nd month, men are eating their leather belts. They boil the strips until the leather softens, and then they chew them for the salt and the memory of meat. They eat seaweed. They eat the membrane from inside birds' eggs. A man called Phipps eats the toe of his boot and then the rest of the boot. The discipline that held together for the first weeks begins to come apart. The boatswain, King, who had drunk himself into a stupor during the wreck and had to be dragged ashore, takes a small group of men and moves them to a separate camp on the other side of the island. He calls them his messmates. He tells them that the captain has no authority over them now because the ship has been lost, and the articles of war, by which a sailor is paid, end when the ship ends. It is a clever argument and not entirely wrong. King and his messmates begin to loot the wreck on their own account. They take what they need and conceal the rest under caches under the moss. When Cheap sends men to bring them back, King meets them with muskets. There are, by this point, 2 visions of survival on the island. They divide men by class mostly, and by the question of who they think they still are. Captain Cheap believes they should stay. He believes the squadron will look for them. He believes the proper conduct, the conduct of officers of the Royal Navy, is to make the best camp they can, fly a flag where it can be seen, salt what meat they can find, and wait. To leave the island would be to compound the original disaster. To attempt the open sea in modified boats in winter in latitudes that had already destroyed a fully crewed warship would be to throw away the lives of men who had survived. He says this in council several times, in a voice that is becoming hoarse from the cold. John Bulkeley, the gunner, believes the captain is wrong. Bulkeley believes, and writes in his journal, that nobody is coming. The squadron, if any of it is still afloat, will have gone north to the Pacific. The Spanish, if they come, will come not as rescuers but as captors. The island will kill them slowly through winter. The longboat, modified and decked, could carry most of them through the Strait of Magellan to the Portuguese settlements in Brazil. It would be a voyage of 2,000 miles in an open boat. It would be very likely a death sentence, but it would be a death sentence with a direction, instead of one without. Bulkley does not say all of this to Cheap at first. He says it to the carpenter and to the cooper and to certain of the seamen he has known the longest. He builds support quietly. He notes who agrees and who does not. He is reading his Bible aloud in the evening still, as he had on the gun deck, and he is choosing his passages. The break comes over a midshipman named Henry Cozens. On the 10th of June, Cozens is at the storehouse, drunk on stolen brandy, demanding more rations than he is owed. The purser will not give them to him. There is shouting. Cozens picks up a stone. The purser draws a pistol. Captain Cheap, told that Cozens is making trouble, comes out of his hut. The captain is carrying a pistol himself. He approaches Cozens from behind. He calls him a mutinous dog. He raises the pistol. He fires. The ball enters his face below his right eye and exits the back of his skull. Cozens does not die immediately. He lies on the cold mud for 14 days, conscious sometimes, before he dies. The surgeon dresses the wound, but is not allowed by the captain to remove him to a warm hut. Cozens lies in the open. Men come and look at him. The shooting of Henry Cozens is for the men who watched it the moment authority breaks. Cheap will later argue, and the Admiralty will eventually accept, that Cozens was a mutineer caught in the act, and the captain's pistol was the proper instrument of discipline. But on Wager Island, in June of 1741, none of the men around the body see it that way. They see an officer who has shot a friend over a cup of brandy. They see a man who could not protect himself dying in the rain because a captain who could not stand a watch had to prove he was still a captain. That night, 3 more men slip away to join the bosun's camp. The longboat, which the carpenter and the gunner had been working on without quite telling the captain, has by then been lengthened, decked, and given a stubby mast and a second sail. It is no longer a longboat. The men have begun to call it the Speedwell. On the night of the 13th of October, 1741, while Captain Cheap is asleep in his hut on the high ground, 81 men board the Speedwell and the 2 small cutters and push out into the bay. The captain wakes in the morning. He limps down to the beach. The Speedwell is a sail on the horizon, moving south. He shouts after her in a voice the wind takes immediately. There are now 2 stories. Bulkley's story sails south. The Speedwell, with 81 men aboard and provisions for a few weeks, runs down the coast of Patagonia in winter. The boat is 50 feet from stem to stern. The men sleep on top of each other in turns in the bilge. The decking covers only part of her, so most of the men live in the open in driving rain and freezing spray. They navigate by the master's lead line and by what stars they can see, and they have one chart, hand-copied by Bulkley from memory of a Spanish original he had once seen in port. They take 3 weeks to reach the western entrance of the Strait of Magellan. The strait in October is a corridor of black water between cliffs that are still showing the snow of the last winter and the snow of the next. The wind funnels through it from west to east, which is the direction they want to go, but it does so in gusts that lay the boat over on her beamans and force them to anchor for days at a time in coves where there is no shelter and no food. They eat shellfish. They eat kelp. A man named John Mooring eats a piece of his shoe, falls sick, and dies in the night. They cannot land in any number because the local Kawaiskar people, watching them from the shore, have already understood that these strangers cannot be trusted. The Kawaiskar, who have lived in the canoes of these channels for thousands of years, do not approach the Speedwell. They watch. The deaths begin in earnest in the 2nd month. It is not, at first, starvation. It is what the master, in his log, calls fluxes. Men in the bilge develop dysentery from drinking the foul water that collects there. They cannot eat, they cannot drink. They lie in their own waste and wait, and the men around them watch and try not to be the next. Bulkley keeps a journal through all of this. He is writing, even now, with publication in mind. He writes the way a lawyer writes, in case he is going to need a defense one day. He records the dates men died. He records the meetings of the ship's council. He records his own arguments against the captain who was no longer there. He is building a book. 11 men are put ashore at a place they call Freshwater Bay in southern Patagonia because there is no longer enough food for everyone aboard. They are given a musket and a few rounds and told that the boat will come back for them. The boat does not come back for them. 8 of them die where they were set down. A few of the others, after a march of unspeakable length, are eventually taken in by Spaniards. The Speedwell rounds the Cape and enters the South Atlantic on the 22nd of December, 1741. She reaches the Portuguese settlement of Rio Grande on the coast of Brazil on the 28th of January, 1742. Of the 81 who had pushed off of WAGER Island in October, 30 are still alive. They are skeletal. Their clothes have rotted off them. Their eyes have gone back into their heads. The Portuguese governor takes them in and gives them food they cannot keep down. Bulke writes in his journal that he is grateful to God. He has already begun the manuscript that will be a book. Captain Cheap's story walks north. When the Speedwell vanished in October, Cheap was left on WAGER Island with 19 men, mostly his loyalists, mostly the officers and the Marines. They had one of the small boats, the barge, which was 20 feet long and not seaworthy for any open passage. They had a few barrels of meat. They had the captain's belief, still, that they would be rescued. They were not rescued. By December, they understood that to stay on the island was to die on the island. The decision was made to take the barge north along the coast, in protected water where possible, and to try to reach the Spanish settlements on the island of Chiloé, 400 miles up the coast. The Spaniards were the enemy. They had been at war for 2 years, but Spanish captivity, at least, would not be Patagonian starvation. They set out in the barge in January of 1442. Within days, 4 of the men were drowned in a surf landing. The barge itself was broken on rocks. They went on by land. What followed, no one who survived ever described completely. Byron, who wrote about it later, wrote around the worst of it. They walked north along a coast of cliffs and forests, eating what they could find. They were taken in for a time by a small group of Kaweskar, who agreed, in exchange for the brass buttons of Cheap's uniform coat, to guide them up the channels in their canoes. The Kaweskar spoke a language none of the English could understand. They communicated by gesture and by a few Spanish words the guides had learned from missionaries decades before. Agua, hambre, trabajar. The guides, after some weeks, abandoned them. The English would later say they were betrayed. The Kaweskar, by then, had concluded that these men would never make the journey, and that to die with them in the channels was not a useful thing to do. They took the food and the buttons and left in their canoe in the night. Cheap and his men, by this point, were down to 6. They were found at last by a Spanish patrol on the island of Chiloé. 2 years had passed since the wreck. They were taken to Santiago. They were treated by their captors with a courtesy that astonished them. They were given clean clothes and beds and food in small amounts so as not to kill them. They were prisoners, but they were also officers of a navy, and the Spanish officers in Santiago understood what those men had walked through. Cheap, in Santiago, learned for the first time that Bulke had reached Brazil. He learned, more important, that Bulke had already published a book. The book had reached London in the autumn of 1443. It had a long title in the style of the time and a short message. The captain of HMS WAGER had murdered a midshipman and driven his crew to a desperate voyage in an open boat. Bulke had survived. He had a printing press. He had the first version of the story. Cheap did not get back to London until 1446. By then, the printing press had been at it for 3 years. The court-martial of the surviving officers of HMS WAGER was aboard HMS Prince George in the harbor at Spithead on the 15th of April, 1746. It lasted 1 day. The Admiralty had assembled 5 years of conflicting depositions, 2 published books, and the testimony of officers who hated each other across the cabin. It had also studied the question of what exactly it wanted to find out. The answer it arrived at was narrow. The court would consider only one charge. Was the loss of His Majesty's ship WAGER in May of 1741 caused by the negligence of her officers? It would not consider whether mutiny had occurred on the island. It would not consider whether Henry Cozens had been murdered or lawfully shot. It would not consider any of these questions, because if it considered any of them, it would have to hang either Cheap or Bulkeley or both, along with a number of other men whose testimony had been useful, and the Royal Navy of 1746 did not want to hang the men who had survived the worst voyage in its recent memory. The verdict was that the loss of the WAGER was attributable to the failure of the master, who had not pressed his recommendation forcefully enough. The master received a reprimand. Cheap was acquitted. Bulkey was not charged at all. The midshipman, John Byron, was not called to testify in any meaningful capacity. He went back to sea within the year and would eventually die a vice-admiral, having sailed 3 times around the world. The Royal Navy, having found the narrowest possible answer to the narrowest possible question, walked away from the affair. But the story did not walk away. It changed the law. Within a few years of the WAGER's loss, the Articles of War were amended so that a sailor's pay continued from the moment of a wreck until his return to England, which removed the argument King had used to justify his mutiny. It changed shipbuilding. The Royal Navy did not, for many years afterward, send a converted East Indiaman on a long-haul expedition with a half-trained crew. It changed practice on the lower deck, where the lesson taken by gunners and boatswains was less about loyalty to a captain than about the importance of keeping a journal. The story did not go away in the imagination of the country that produced it. The 2 books were read. The midshipman's grandson read his grandfather's narrative as a small boy in Aberdeen and never forgot it. The poem he eventually wrote, called Don Juan, contains a long shipwreck scene that draws directly on the WAGER. The starving crew of that fictional shipwreck eat their shoes, as the WAGER's crew had. They draw lots, as the survivors in the Speedwell are said to have drawn lots. The story slept in libraries and in folklore for 270 years. In 2023, the writer David Grann published a book that opened it again. The court-martial transcript was reread. The journals were reread. The names of the dead were named again. Some of those names have, in the years since, been found on the bones. WAGER Island is still there. It is not on any commercial map. The Chilean government calls it Isla WAGER, which is the only acknowledgement in any official document of that country of what happened there. There are no roads. There is no settlement. The Kawascar, who guided Cheap and Byron north through the channels, are very nearly gone now. The fish camps that once stood along the coast are stones in the moss. A small expedition of archaeologists visited the island some years ago. They walked the high beach above the wreck site. They found ship's nails, the brass guard of an officer's sword, and in a hollow of peat that had not been disturbed since the 18th century, the femur of a man. You can stand on that beach now, if you can get to it. The wind off the Pacific has not changed since 1741. It still comes from the west. It still does not stop. It still has the names in it.